Good evening, everyone. My name is Patrick Tapia. I'm the Vice President of Counseling for HS2 Academy. So welcome to tonight's seminar. So tonight we're going to be talking about successful college applications, and we're also going to be looking at some case studies of HS2 students who've been pretty successful in their applications last fall. So we will go through and kind of look at the lay of the land in terms of like what are the latest trends in admissions this year and what you can do about it, right? So we're going to talk about like practical tips and strategies that you can use in order for you to be more successful. Now, of course, this is going to be very beneficial for people who are already seniors right now, but of course, it's still very applicable even if you're a sophomore or a junior listening in, or even a much younger student, because then you can kind of see ahead of time what's going on and what you can do to strengthen your profile. We do ask that you refrain from recording any of the information in this seminar this evening and save any questions you have until the end of the seminar, please. Thank you. All right, so first, the changing landscape. What's been going on as far as selective private schools? Well, there's certain key trends that I want to point out. One, many of you are already familiar with this, but a lot of top schools still remain test optional this year, right? Which means you do not have to submit an SAT or ACT score, and they would simply consider you based on your grades, your activities, and recommendation letters. So this past year actually saw a huge increase in the number of applicants and applications, especially to the Ivies, right? So on average, the Ivy schools received over 30%, and in some cases, like I think for Columbia, they even received like 50% more applications. So it's very, very competitive now. There are a lot more people applying to top schools. But interestingly enough, though, there was actually a decline in the number of total applicants for certain colleges, right? Which means across the board, it's not as many people. Now, what's happening though is that even if there are not as many applicants, each individual applicant, however, is applying to more colleges than ever before, right? So the Common App, which is the main place where people apply for private schools, there was actually an increase of 11% in the total number of applications, but only a 2% increase in the individual number of applicants. But that's just for Common App for private schools, right? So across the board for like some state systems actually saw a decrease in the number of people applying. All right, so if you're looking at the results for Ivy League schools, you could see what I'm talking about here in terms of the massive drop off, because a lot more people were thinking that they could be more aggressive last year because, the schools are test optional. You don't need to submit an SAT or ACT. What ended up happening then is across the board, pretty much every single Ivy League school saw their acceptance rates decrease by quite a lot, right? So as you can see, there are now 3 Ivy League schools that have overall acceptance rates of under 4%. It used to be just Harvard, but now Princeton and Columbia joined them as well, with Yale not too far behind, actually. And even Brown at 5.5% is also very, very close to that threshold as well. Okay, now, if you think this is only a trend in the Ivy League schools, then you'd be sadly mistaken. A lot of top universities, I would say, especially the ones that are in major metropolitan areas, are seeing their acceptance rates drop too. So you could see schools like USC is down to 12%, NYU down to about 12.8%. Boston College went down, also about 5% last year. I mean, some colleges didn't really change all that much, but the trend is that the ones that are in bigger cities have seen a massive drop off, simply because I guess it's more popular now to apply to those colleges in large metropolitan areas. All right, so let's also examine what's going on among the UC system, right? So let's see what's going on there. So one of the key developments last year is that the UCs went test blind. What this means is that they simply will not look at your SAT or ACT scores, right? And this policy will go through until spring 2025, at which time they're going to decide whether or not they want to replace it with a different type of test, not the SAT or ACT, that the UCs would then use as the replacement UC entrance exam. So we are still waiting to hear. There hasn't been any official word yet as to whether or not it's going to be replaced by a new test. So what's happened, because they're test blind now, is we saw an increase in the diversity of the incoming freshman class. So the incoming class is now comprised of 37% Latino or Latina, But the Asian percentage has actually remained the same. So I know some parents were wondering about that, and they're saying like, oh, if it's more diverse, does that mean they're accepting fewer Asian students? Interestingly enough, no, right? So the last 4 or 5 years, it's stayed steady at about 34%. So one of the trends right now is that like I've been talking to and hearing a lot of things from like UC admissions that they're really looking for more evidence of students' passions, especially in their essays, and their desire to develop solutions to the problems in their community, especially with COVID, right? So a lot of the success stories that they want to talk about are cases of students who went out of their way to help out their parents, maybe their immediate community, raising money or finding ways to help other people, especially, with a pandemic going on and everything. So that could be one thing strategically you could use in order to maybe enhance your chances in your application, is really try to put a spotlight on your interests, your passions, and also what you've done to make an impact in your community. Okay, so this past year has seen a record number of applicants to the entire UC system across the board, but it's also same as what we saw with the Ivies. It's kind of uneven, right? So at the top end, you see Berkeley and UCLA increase their total number of applicants by about 28%, but schools like Riverside, not too much, only about 6%, and even Merced actually went down, right? The number of applicants to Merced went down by almost 2%. Right? So that's definitely something where there's not automatically this increase in number of applicants. I think what's happening here is that it's just skewing upward. So there are more people, applying to more campuses now than ever before, whereas maybe someone would only apply to maybe the bottom 3 or 4 UCs. Maybe they're more encouraged to go ahead and take a shot at some of the top UCs now. So the total number of applications increased, but there's not a sign that all of a sudden there's like a 30% increase in the number of people applying to the UCs altogether. So as we can see, that's resulted in some pretty drastic decreases in the acceptance rates for the top UCs. Looking at the top two, UCLA actually decreased by almost 4%. So they're about a little under 11% now, 10.7%. And then Berkeley went down by about 3%. So UCLA is now the single most competitive public university in the country. Right now, on the contrary, if you look at the bottom here, Merced actually went up surprisingly, right? So that's pretty rare among the UCs, but they went up by about 10%, which means, it's probably a pretty good safety. But I would say, given the unpredictability of admissions these days with the UCs being test blind, it actually makes a lot more sense for you to want to try to apply to more campuses to give yourself more of a safety net. Because like we've seen some surprise cases where someone will get accepted to Berkeley or LA, but get rejected by like UC Irvine, for instance, right? So if you want to enhance your chances of having more options for UCs, it's smart for you to go ahead and maybe just consider applying to more UCs this year. All right, so one of the key strategic elements to getting an edge in terms of applications is to consider applying to one or more schools with early action or early decision. And we'll go through and maybe explain candidates are now applying early to colleges, and even more so because of the test optional policies. So it seems like in previous years, one of the impediments or one of the obstacles preventing more students from applying early is that they were waiting to be able to take the SAT or ACT or raise their scores to be competitive enough. But this year, or this past year, given that a lot of schools are test optional, that sort of encouraged a lot of students to try to apply more for early action or early decision. And that's why we see this massive spike, right? And in fact, among the Ivies, just for EA/ED rounds, it had increased by about 30 to 50% in terms of the number of applications overall. And this is also matched, by the way, by a trend where these top schools like the Ivies have increasingly accepted more of their incoming classes in the early round. So Columbia, for instance, accepted 43% of their incoming freshman class in their ED round, whereas Brown, which is the highest one, accepted more than half. Right. So by the time ED is over, they've already accepted more than half of their incoming freshman class, which would, of course, limit the number of spaces available for those who are thinking of applying for a regular decision at that point. Okay, So let me kind of go through a brief overview of the different types of early decision or early action processes or early admission processes. So the first one that a lot of people are familiar with is early decision, which means you apply early, typically by November 1st, and you're typically notified pretty early as well, sometime by early to mid-December. And one key distinction here for early decision is that this offer is binding, which means you agree to attend that school if they extend you an offer of admission. Okay. There is also an option called early decision 2, with the main difference here being that instead of applying early, you would apply by the same deadline as regular decision. And presumably it's going to increase your chances as well, but not quite as much as early decision 1, right? So if a school had 2 rounds, early decision 1 would definitely give you a bigger boost because they're trying to scoop up a bigger percentage of their class during that ED1 round, right? But it's still an advantage over regular decision. So ED2 makes more sense if you have a clear cut like second choice school, right? So if you say, for instance, apply ED to your number 1 choice school, but you didn't get in, if there's a school that you're considering for ED2, I think that would make perfect sense. Early action, on the other hand, is similar to early decision in the sense that you apply early and you're typically notified early, but not quite as typically early as ED. So you typically find out between December to even as later as February in some cases for some schools. But the key distinction here is that this is not binding, which means you can wait until all your regular decision results are out before you decide. So of course, the benefit of early action then is it can alleviate some stress on the part of students, because if you hear from 1 or 2 early schools that you got in, then you may not need to apply to as many safety schools, or you may not have to worry about whether or not you're going to get into college at all, right? So it provides a lot of peace of mind for some students, and I think that's the main benefit for some students. Now, some really competitive private schools have a variation of early action called either single choice or restricted early action. And this is really limited to a handful of schools, primarily Stanford, Yale, and Harvard. Like Princeton used to have it, but they did away with it like a couple of years ago. There are a couple other schools that do have variants of this, but those are the prominent ones. And basically, it's the same rules as early action. You apply early, you find out early, but the main restriction here is that you're not allowed to apply to other private early action schools. You are, however, allowed to apply to EA schools if they're public universities. So if you wanted to apply early to the University of Michigan, for instance, you can do that. If you wanted to apply to Georgia Tech or Purdue, those are institutions that you can pair up with a school like a Harvard or Stanford and not have to worry about any sort of conflicts. You would do the same thing with an ED as well, by the way. Right? So you can apply to 1 or more early action schools, but you cannot apply single choice or restricted early action and ED at the same time because they would conflict. Okay. Now, some schools do offer something called priority admissions, which just basically means if you apply by an earlier deadline, you have a better shot, but you would still be notified about the same time as regular decision. So oftentimes we tell students, hey, if you're planning to apply to that school anyway, you might as well try to make the priority deadline, so that way you get a better shot at getting into that college. And then lastly, there is an option called rolling admissions, which is kind of like first come, first served. If you send in an application pretty early, they can let you know within typically 4 to 8 weeks if you got accepted. In fact, we've already gotten some students apply through rolling admissions, and we've already actually gotten some admissions, right? So, like there are a couple of students who applied to University of Arizona. I think there was one for Penn State, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, there are some students who've already gotten offers of admission from some schools because they applied really, really early. Okay. So one of the key things that you want to look at here is that oftentimes people think that ED is great because you compare it to the total acceptance rate, which is true that you can look at it that way, but it's even more accurate for you to compare the EA or ED rate with the RD only rate. Now, of course, this is not something that all schools would publish, but it's going to be really helpful for you to see just how enhanced your chances would be. So for the most part, single choice early action schools give you some advantage, as you can see here, Harvard and Yale. If you compare RD only versus their single choice early action round, it's about almost 3 times right? But if you look at schools that have early decision among the Ivies, it's 4, almost 5 times as much, right? So for Brown, for instance, overall acceptance rate is 5.4, but if you're comparing their 15.9% ED rate compared to their 3.5% regular decision only, it makes a lot of sense for you to really try to apply early if you know that that's like your dream school. So one of the key things that students need to decide right now is to do a lot of research, try to figure out if they really are very interested in the school for early decision. And if it's a good fit and you're willing to commit to the school, that's probably, in this case, becoming more and more your best option to get into a top college like the Ivies, right? Because the more and more they're accepting a larger percentage of their incoming classes to the early round, that leaves very, very precious few spots left for people who are applying for regular decision. Okay, so bottom line, should you apply EA or ED? So in most cases, we do say yes. In fact, for our students for HS2, like we almost always tell all our students, you have to apply to at least one early action or early decision school. So not always ED though, because some students don't really want to commit to a school. But if they don't want to commit to an ED, we at least have them apply to 1 or 2 early action schools, because for a couple of reasons. One, applying early forces students to really get on top of things and finish their applications and their essays earlier. But 2, it is peace of mind, right? Having to find out from at least one of the early schools that you got in means that students aren't as anxious or apprehensive about like having to wait like 2, 3, 4 months before they find out, which is the first college they got into. So it makes a lot of sense for you to try to apply to at least 1 or 2 early schools, if only like an early safety. Okay. However, I would say early decision probably works best for strong applicants anyway. This is not really an ideal situation to do a long shot if your grades and test scores are nowhere near competitive for that particular school. Because what happens is that if you are a much weaker student, chances are that college's admissions office will tend to want to wait until your first semester senior year grades are out. Okay. So let's say, especially if you struggled in junior year, especially the second semester of junior year, right? So it's not a good idea to go aggressive for EA or ED schools if you're in that situation. Okay, you could still apply to 1 or 2 early safety schools, but it's probably not a good idea to aim too far up or too high as far as going ED if you struggled 11th grade. Now, conversely, if you had some bad grades, but it's much early on, like 9th grade, yes, you could totally look at schools that are good fits that you could feel like you're competitive for and try to apply for early decision, because it's probably going to give you the best boost in terms of your chances. Now, statistically speaking, what we found over the years is that ED works best for schools that are in the reach category, which means not dream category or far reach category where they're like really, really high up there and almost impossible, but competitive enough so that's a little bit more on the harder end, but not easy enough where you're pretty guaranteed a shot, or like even if like a 50-50 school, you would not want to go ED to a school where maybe you have a 50% chance to get in for obvious reasons, right? Because you don't want to sell yourself short. You don't want to apply to a school and, lock yourself in and find out that you maybe could have gotten into a better school later on, right? So that's definitely why you do need to make sure you're making a good judgment in terms of, trying to figure out like how strong are you? What are the chances for certain schools? Because then you can make a much more informed decision based on the data out there in terms of what your chances are actually for the EA or ED rounds. Okay. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about today is standardized testing. So you've heard me talk a lot about schools being test optional. So that begs the question, do we want to go test optional? Should we just not bother with SAT or ACT? Well, I mean, the honest answer, it depends. It depends on how strong you are for testing, right? So one of the key things that you need to know about, of course, the UCs, if the UCs are main target schools, they are test blind. They don't look at SAT or ACT, but very few students only apply to the UCs and Cal States anyway, right? A lot of students who are going to be applying to the UC system will also want to take a shot and apply for private schools. So if those private schools may want testing, especially later on, then it makes more sense for you to go ahead and take an SAT or ACT, as long as you can do pretty well, right? So a couple other trends within the last year and a half is that they've already done away with the SAT subject tests. These used to be called SAT2s. So colleges no longer want them because the college board simply did away with them. They're no longer offered at all, right? And neither is the essay section of the SAT one, right? And from what I've been hearing, it's only a matter of time before the ACT also follows suit. So it's pretty much within hopefully the next year or two, they're probably not going to have the ACT essay as well. Okay, now, even though a lot of top colleges are in fact test optional, this does not necessarily mean that a lot of schools prefer students who don't submit the test. In fact, what we can see from the data here is that most students accepted to top colleges still end up reporting an SAT or an ACT. For instance, like UPenn, one of the Ivy League schools, 75% of the admitted students there actually submitted an SAT or an ACT. Now, in a recent WACAT conference, some of our counselors attended, they've heard admissions people conceding they still feel much more confident accepting a student who has test scores because they have better predictability, right? So they have more of a sense in terms of how they might fare at their school. And so, our prediction is that like a lot of schools are test optional just for this upcoming fall. I mean, there are a handful of schools that have just decided, hey, we're just going to be test optional forever. So if they've made a change and made it permanent, they're going to go test optional. But the most competitive schools, I would say like schools in the top 25 or top 30, they've only committed to stay test optional for this coming fall, right? So for the freshman class of like this coming or next fall's incoming class, I should say. Okay. So long story short, test optional tends to work best if you're already a straight A student, but you struggle a little bit with testing, right? So if testing is not a relative strength, but you have great grades, at least relative to the schools you're applying to, then test optional could be an option you could consider, right? Because it might actually give you a better shot at some schools that you normally wouldn't have been competitive for if you're trying to submit an SAT or ACT score. Okay. All right, so in order for you to determine this, what I've done here is I've looked at the data for a lot of, a sampling of like a lot of top colleges here. And this data you can find yourself, right? So there are things called common data sets that you can find online where the schools will publish not an average SAT or ACT score, but they'll give you a range. They'll tell you their 25th percentile and 75th percentile SAT scores and 25th and 75th percentile ACT scores. So the way you want to look at this then is that if you're shooting for a top college, if you're looking at like the Harvards and Stanfords and MITs of the world, we normally suggest that you should shoot for having like a mid 1500 or higher, or about a 35 or 36 on the ACT. That would put you in this competitive range. And so why 75th percentile? Why not 50th percentile? Because a lot of these top colleges will be accepting students with much lower scores for one reason or another. They're like maybe recruiting athletes, or they have special VIP cases, or they're accepting students who are underrepresented minorities who might traditionally have shorter test scores or lower test scores. So bottom line, if you're Asian, the 75th percentile is probably closer to a realistic Asian average. Okay, and this is actually borne by our data as well. So in other words, the students who are getting into these top schools, their numbers for SAT and ACT scores average closer to the 75th percentile. So this is probably your benchmark for what kind of a score you would need in order for you to be competitive for this range. Now, beyond just like a top 15 school, if you're looking at schools like USC, UCLA, or maybe a Michigan, slightly lower expectation. You want something maybe in the low 1500s or maybe a 33 or higher on the ACT to put you in the competitive range for those schools. And then of course, beyond that, like for schools around like the UC San Diego, University of Washington range, you're looking probably at like mid 1400s and at least, let's say, a 31 on the ACT, right? So that just gives you a range. Now, if you're below that, but you have better grades than the average of that school, then yeah, you probably should consider going test optional. If you're in the 75th percentile, then you probably do want to submit the scores, right? So that just maybe is a way for you to figure out whether or not you want to take advantage of test optional or whether or not you want to really submit your scores at this point. Okay, so what about AP testing? How does this fit into all this? So AP testing is still considered by many schools, but not really as admissions tests per se. So what we mean here is that a lot of people, there's been like rumors floating about that SAT and ACT, because they're becoming less important, all of a sudden AP tests will all of a sudden take their place. I'm here to tell you that that's simply not true. If it were true, then College Board would never have done away with subject tests because they test much the same content, right? So the fact that College Board did away with subject tests means that it's really not all that helpful or predictive in terms of admissions purposes. So AP tests are largely there for placement credits, right? But they're also there to help them contextualize your grades. And I think this is really the main way that colleges use AP testing. So they would look at your transcript and let's say, for example, you got a 5 in an AP test, like AP biology, but you got a couple of Bs in the class for AP biology. Your test score might indicate that maybe you have a better grasp of the material, but maybe the course was just graded very harshly, right? On the flip side, if you got a 1 or 2 in an AP test, but you got an A in the class, and lo and behold, everybody in your class gets an A, that might suggest to them that that A might not be as valuable because there might be some grade inflation going on, right? So that's the way they use AP scores to contextualize your grades. Now, keep in mind, no school you apply to even wants your official AP scores. It's all just self-reported, right? So it's not really considered that important. However, the grade in your AP classes is in fact very important, right? Colleges want to see that you're challenging yourself by taking the most rigorous classes available, but the test is sort of like just like a bonus, right? It's not really something that would replace your performance in the class. Neither is it something that you should put a lot of effort to self-study for a lot of AP exams because they simply do not have the same impact or weight as taking more AP coursework or even taking outside college coursework. Okay, that's probably going to be more impactful to your admissions chances than, say, for example, studying for 1 or 2 extra APs. Okay, so by and large, if you're a high level achieving student, if you're getting straight A's, you probably should be shooting for like mostly 5s. 1, 2, or 3 4s probably not going to necessarily jeopardize your chances, right? So that's kind of the range that you'd want to be aiming for in this situation. Okay, so now next is activities. So how do you stand out? Because those previous 2 that I mentioned, test scores and your grades, of course, you want to make sure, of course, that you're competitive for these schools. But given that for a lot of top schools, they're going to have equally competitive students, right? They're going to have students with close to straight A's. They're going to have students with 34, 35, or 36 on the ACT. So how do you distinguish yourself? Well, this is really where the activities come in, right? So we normally encourage students to have activities that they choose that align with their talents and abilities, right? So there's no such thing I heard of about like, oh, you must have a sport, you must have this or that. There's not really a checklist of things that colleges look for. Neither is it a mandated requirement for you to have a little bit of everything, right? And I think that's maybe the wrong approach. Some parents want their kids to be completely well-rounded, that they have a little bit of everything. You must have this, you must have that. But the problem with that sometimes is that if you overextend yourself and you have too many activities, but you're not necessarily very good at it, you might be robbing yourself of the chance to get very, very good at 1 or 2 activities that'll actually distinguish you more from other students. Now, I myself had been an interviewer for Harvard for several years, and in my experience, when we rated students based on the criteria they used, they're much more impressed by higher level accomplishments within your clubs or activities rather than the sheer number of activities that you have. Okay, so even if you only had like 3 or 4 clubs, but you're doing it at a very, very high level, that's probably going to be more impactful in terms of your chances of getting into a top college than, let's say, for instance, having 6, 7, or 8 clubs or activities, but yet be very kind of mediocre in each and one of those clubs, right? So it makes more sense for you to find early on, what are your passions? What are you good at? What can you do at a very high level so that perhaps eventually you could be competitive at maybe like a statewide or even the national level in a certain activity? That's the types of activities that I feel would probably move the needle more in terms of like a top school. Okay. Now, in light of all the recent admission scandals that you probably heard about in the news, colleges are now looking for more evidence of things like love of learning, genuine passion, concern for others in the community. So these are the types of buzzwords that are floating around at admissions. So it's best for you to try to demonstrate these through your activities, right? So if you look like you're just doing activities just to have things on your resume, and you don't really sound like you care too much about them, it's not going to be as impressive. So you could try to demonstrate why these activities matter so much to you in your essays, especially. But typically in other forms like the recommendation letters, if you get a chance to interview for some of your colleges, try to really talk about why you became so passionate about these activities. That's where I think it's going to make more of an impact, and it's going to allow you to really put a spotlight on these different activities that you spent so much time, like really developing. Okay, now with standardized testing sort of taking a little bit more of a backseat because colleges are now more test optional, it's also really important for you to make really good connections with your teachers and even your school counselor, right? So you need to be able to talk to them more. Having good, solid recommendation letters is also another way for you to be able to sort of really amplify all the different things that you're doing for your activities. So if your teachers and counselor know about all these amazing things that you do even outside of their class, some of them will probably try to limit the rec letter to just their experience in the classroom, but others are more than willing to talk about all the different things that you do outside of their class. Okay. Now, top colleges are also looking for what they call top shelf intellectual potential. What I mean by this is that if they see that you're just a hard worker and you get good grades, but there's no evidence that you could be like a scholar in your field, that's not going to distinguish you as much either from some other students. So typically speaking, for certain fields, if you can do things like competitive summer programs, if you could do research, do an internship for your major, I think that's another way too that you can really distinguish yourself from a lot of other students out there. Okay, now a really, really good place where you can invest a lot of your time and energy these days is by having more volunteering, right? So one of the key things that we've seen in recent years is that when we look at the common factors of a lot of top students that we get into colleges like, Princeton, MIT, Harvard, Stanford, the one common denominator here is that they have very, very extensive commitments to volunteering and community service. And there was a report that was published about 5 years ago, and there was a follow-up to this about 2 years ago, where a lot of admissions people met at Harvard for a conference, and they came up with three main recommendations that they want to give out to other admissions people and high school counselors, right? So recommendation number one is that they want to see what they call meaningful, sustained community service. And of course, the key word here is the word sustained. So what they mean by that is that they want to see at least a year of sustained service, as opposed to, let's say, for example, students who will only do maybe volunteering for like a week. Maybe they'll volunteer for the whole week, but then nothing else past that week, right? And this is typically true of people who will do like one of these like volunteer abroad programs where they do it for maybe 1 or 2 weeks, and they'll say, oh, I'm good, I already have like a lot of hours from that volunteering, and they just stop doing anything related to community service for the rest of high school. That's good. It's better not doing anything at all, but that's not nearly as good as someone who's shown consistent dedication and commitment to 1 or 2 community service organizations. All right, recommendation number 2 is collective action that takes on community challenges. The more impressive types of community service in their minds will be ones that directly tackle problems that you see in your immediate community. So if you can show that you've done some volunteer projects, or you even started your own initiatives or programs, or even started your own nonprofit to help address some of the problems you see around your community, that's definitely going to be much more impressive, right? So strive for that if it's at all possible. And then lastly, they also want to see what they call authentic, meaningful experiences with diversity. So instead of, let's say, for example, volunteering of any sort is good, mind you, right? So it's still better than not doing anything. But like, if your volunteering is largely like data entry and you're not really interacting with many people and you're just kind of like on the computer, like typing things out, it's still better than not doing any volunteering, but they would be more impressed if you can do volunteering that really engages with and exposes you to people of different backgrounds and cultures, so that you can really show this appreciation for diversity, right? Now, this is not limited to community service, mind you. So if you have clubs and school-based activities that really, really try to, show that you're open to new cultural experiences, for instance, I think that could definitely be something that would, make you stand out. right? Because colleges do want to put together very diverse classes, right? And so if you already have evidence that you've long been someone who is looking to try to expand your horizons and engaging with people from different backgrounds and cultures, then that really puts you ahead of other candidates in that category. Okay, so how can HS2 Academy help you with all this then? So fortunately, HS2 has a lot of resources that we can use to help students in order to really make themselves stand out relative to their peers. So, we do have the typical offerings that you would expect from our academy. We will have online and in-branch homework club help so that students can get access to teachers who can help them with a wide range of subjects, not just for homework, but also to prepare them for upcoming quizzes and tests. We have online SAT and ACT courses for like specific test dates. So if you're shooting for the October test date or the December test date, we have a class that's deliberately focused on preparing you just for that test date. Okay. We also have a unique offering called Test Prep Foundations class. So for younger students, especially, if you haven't really decided yet if you're going to take SAT or ACT, this would be a great opportunity for you to kind of like cover the material that's common to both. Okay, and of course, we also have enrichment classes for things like English writing and math as well. So if you want to find out more, please visit our website. It's hs2academy.com, and you can find out the latest schedules are all there as well. So some other unique offerings is that for the last year and a half or so, HS2 has partnered with UC Riverside to have exclusive courses offered directly just for our students. All right, and the great thing about these classes is that they're all already UC approved. So whichever UC campus you go to, it'll be categorized or it'll count as part of their general education requirements, which also means that if every UC will accept these courses, that pretty much means that any private school you send this to will also accept these credits. And the great thing about this is that any college course that you take that they're going to accept as transfer credits will be counted the same as an AP weighted semester. Okay, and the two that we have this fall are really great, right? So we have a course on financial accounting, which is really helpful even for non-business students, right? Because these days, even people who are maybe going for a tech major or you're going pre-med, having a basic understanding of accounting can definitely help you in terms of things like personal finance, or like once you decide to maybe kind of like launch your own business venture, even if you have like mostly like a tech or engineering background, I think this could still be very helpful. Another course that we're offering is called Energy and Environment, which is really about looking into all the different factors that take place as to why we're really kind of focused on things like energy conservation, renewable energy, right? In fact, this has become such a large focus of a lot of schools right now that Stanford has even launched a new school specifically focused on climate and sustainability, because a lot of top universities now see it as that like this is a big priority. So students who can show that they are very much aware of the importance of these issues, that's going to make them stand out even more as students who are maybe a little bit more philosophically aligned to what the schools now prioritize. Okay, another offering that we have a certificate program through UCR for cybersecurity. So we have a lot of students who are interested in general computer science or engineering, but they haven't really explored much more specific subsets of it, right? So this is a great opportunity for students who maybe would want to look into this possibility of studying cybersecurity. And that way, if they want to specialize in that major later on, they already have a little bit of background for it. So this is also highly encouraged. Now, we also have a unique internship this fall, right, through George Mason University, and they're one of the top schools for government and public policy. And so the internship that they're offering for us this fall is a 10-week internship where this is especially good for students who are not only interested in things like political science or public policy or gender studies, because that's going to be the focus of the actual research, but it's also going to be very data heavy, right? So the students will learn how to use like statistical software packages like SPSS. They'll become familiar with like data analysis techniques. And so this is a really great internship for those, social science, political science types, but it's also really good for people who might be looking at data science as a major or computer science as a major, right? Because it'll increase their exposure to the way technology is used in this sort of like the big data, what do you call this? I guess environment that we now have for a lot of social sciences. All right, now HS2 Academy does also have its own nonprofit wing called Compassionate Scholars. So our students can also get more access to like unique volunteer opportunities that they might not be able to get outside, right? So every single student who applies will then get access to these unique opportunities. HS2 also is a certifying organization for the Presidential Volunteer Service Award, so that way, if students wanted to go ahead and accumulate or aggregate their hours from different community service places, we can do that for them and file for the Presidential Service Award for them. Okay, so lastly, I want to talk about some case studies of some students that were very successful in my mind, not necessarily always just the top schools, but I just wanted to give you kind of like a little bit of like a range here in terms of students who got into some pretty good universities, and maybe a little bit about their background, so you kind of know what to shoot for in terms of your own goals, right? So we have before we do that, just as a kind of a way to look at the success rate that we had, like HS2 really prides itself on having the best results every single year, right? And this past year, we had very good success, especially for top universities. We had like 5 students get into Stanford, another 4 got into Harvard, and even for a lot of the UCs, right? So the UCs are getting much harder these days, but we happen to get 64 of our students into UC Berkeley and another 47 into UCLA, right? So this track record we're especially proud of because we know what it takes to get into these top schools, and we really try to get our students every single opportunity to be much more competitive. All right, so the first case study here is a student who had a 3.78 GPA. Okay, so not necessarily the highest, and in fact, this student's grades took a dip in 11th grade, right? So this student got 7 Bs in 11th grade. The weighted GPA is still not bad, which means that the student took some pretty challenging courses, but this student decided to go test optional because he or she didn't have a high enough SAT score relative to the schools that they were trying for, right? So they took some pretty advanced math classes actually, right? So multivariable calculus and linear algebra at a local community college. And some of the interesting things about the student's profile is that they were the founder and president of their school's bridge club. This is not the making the bridges that you cross a river with, but like the card game bridge, right? The student was also a badminton varsity player, participated in quiz bowl, math club, and participated in the Ross summer program for math, but also served as an editor-in-chief for their school newspaper for journalism, right? So very diverse activities. So even if the grades weren't necessarily a highlight and the student didn't even have any test scores, the activities, in my opinion, looked pretty strong, right? And so fortunately, because the student did show that he or she had a lot of passion for these various activities, especially for math, right? So very high level for math. This student actually got into UC Berkeley, even with the 7 Bs, which I thought was quite the accomplishment considering how competitive Berkeley was last year, okay? This next student, perfect 4.0 GPA, 4.5 weighted, SAT score, not bad, pretty solid actually at a 1530, right? So the profile of the student though, very well-rounded, was a varsity soccer player, both for the school team and a club soccer team, served as the class treasurer, also did an earth science summer internship at Stanford, which is pretty impressive, volunteered at a local Kaiser hospital, had a part-time job as a cashier, but also took part in a lot of different environmental activism groups. So overall, the student was applying as an environmental science major. And this student actually got into Stanford, which made sense given what I told you earlier about Stanford actually opening up that new school for like sustainability and climate, right? So they're looking for more students now who are interested in these types of fields. So as actually like a perfect alignment of like her interests matched what Stanford was looking for. So it's sometimes knowing what the school is looking for that could give you that edge, okay? This last student we're going to take a look at, also great GPA 4.0. The weighted GPA may be slightly slower than the last one, but had a 1580. So this student, just a total rock star across the board. Editor-in-chief of the school paper, did an internship with a city council member to conduct research on like solutions for the homeless problem in their city. The student was a leader in the school district's anti-racism task force, president of mock trial, served as a juror in the city's peer court. They'll usually have these youth courts where instead of like students going to juvie, they would have like students serving as the lawyers and also as the jury, right? And so he or she participated in that, but it was also fairly talented and artistic, right? So also had piano and flute and was also an athlete. played in the school badminton team. So this student actually was able to get into Harvard for regular decision. Okay, so overall, these are some pretty impressive students, but as you can see here, some of the key factors here is that you see that these students are very passionate. They do a lot of community or outreach service or things to do with their cities, for instance, right? They're very passionate about like certain causes. And I think that's what colleges are looking for these days. Not just that you're good on paper, but you look like the type of person who could be a difference maker, not just in their college, but when you graduate from their college as well. And I think that's what set, especially the last two students, case 2 and case 3. Okay. All right. So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and open it up for Q&A for the last 15 minutes then. So that way, if you have more specific questions, please feel free to go ahead and do so. So I put the